In our study, we were able to model psychiatric symptoms as dimensions, and then we related these dimensions to brain structure.
To do this, we applied an exploratory factor analysis to 112 items in a psychiatric screening interview, which was collected in the entire sample of 9,500 youth. This exploratory factor analysis yielded 4 dimensions of psychopathology, including factors for anxious misery, psychosis, behavioral symptoms, and fear.
That's Dr. Antonia Kaskirkin and Dr. Theodore Satterthwaite, who will talk about the research on dimensions of psychopathology and brain structure in young people. Their work appears in the December 2019 issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry. I'm Michael Roy, Executive Editor of the American Journal of Psychiatry, and this is AJP Audio. Dr. Antonia Kaskirkin received her PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Minnesota. She was a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, working with Dr. Theodore Satterthwaite, before joining Vanderbilt University as an assistant professor in psychology. Her research focuses on identifying neurobiological markers of internalizing disorders. She integrates measures such as neuroimaging and psychophysiology to develop a comprehensive understanding of the basic mechanisms that underlie anxiety and depressive disorders. Dr. Theodore Satterthwaite is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania Perelman School of Medicine. He completed medical and graduate training at Washington University in St. Louis, where he was a student of Randy L. Buckner. He was then a psychiatry resident and a neuropsychiatry fellow at Penn under the mentorship of Raquel Gurr. He joined the faculty of the Department of Psychiatry in 2014, and he has served as the Director of Imaging Analytics of the Brain Behavior Laboratory since 2015. His research uses multimodal neuroimaging to describe both normal and abnormal patterns of brain development in order to better understand the origins of neuropsychiatric illness. His work has been recognized with the Claremont Prize for Clinical Research from the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation and with the Biobehavioral Research Award for Innovative New Scientists from the National Institute of Mental Health. Dr. Kaskirkin and Dr. Satterthwaite are co-authors of an article in our December issue entitled Evidence for Dissociable Linkage of Dimensions of Psychopathology to Brain Structure in Youths. Dr. Kaskirkin, Dr. Satterthwaite, hello and welcome to the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Now, your article begins by noting that many psychiatric disorders have high rates of comorbidity and that many symptoms appear across disorders. You note that some abnormalities in brain structure are described in similar ways across disorders. You mentioned that many of the neuroimaging studies that have reported these results have been in adults, even though most psychiatric disorders begin to emerge when people are younger. Moreover, you write that some prior research has not fully accounted for the dimensional nature of mental disorders. So first, could you talk about what you hope to achieve in this study?
Yes, I would be happy to. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the data that was used for this study, which comes from the PNC, the Philadelphia Neurodevelopmental Cohort. The PNC is a large community-based sample of non-help-seeking youth funded by the NIMH and overseen by Drs. Raquel Gurr and Hakan Hekanarsson at the University of Pennsylvania. As part of a larger genotyping study, 9,500 participants between 8 and 21 years of age completed a clinical interview and a cognitive battery. And of that pool, 1,601 participants were randomly selected for multimodal neuroimaging. So this data set is particularly useful for the current study because it provides us with a broad range of psychiatric symptoms with substantial comorbidity, similar to population prevalence. So the purpose of the current study was to understand the association between brain structure and dimensions of psychopathology in youth. So as noted, there is high comorbidity among psychiatric disorders. We know that patients with multiple mental health diagnoses are the rule rather than the exception in psychiatry. And epidemiological research confirms that of adults with a mental health diagnosis in the U.S., around 22% carry 2 mental health diagnoses, and about 23% carry 3 or more diagnoses. Furthermore, there's evidence of neurobiological nonspecificity, with similar abnormalities of brain structure being found across multiple disorders. So this has really led to increasing interest in the field in understanding not only how disorders differ, but in what ways they're actually the same in terms of the brain. And based on the significant overlap between disorders, we were interested in examining neurobiological similarities common across psychiatric disorders. So to do this, we used a dimensional approach. So many neuroimaging studies have typically used a case control design that compares a particular disorder to a control group, usually while excluding those with comorbidities. But researchers have long known that psychopathology symptoms are dimensional. They exist on a continuum from health to disorder. In our study, we were able to model psychiatric symptoms as dimensions, and then we related these dimensions to brain structure. We also want to highlight the importance of examining these associations in youth, as most prior work has been restricted to adult samples. And we know that many psychiatric disorders have an earlier onset during development. So taking these limitations of prior work into account, our study attempts to increase our understanding of the neurostructural deficits associated with psychopathology using a dimensional approach in a large sample of youth.
Well, as you mentioned, part of your analysis identified dimensions of psychopathology, and these are presented nicely in Figure 1 in your article, alongside various disorders so that the reader can see which symptoms correspond with certain disorders. Could you walk us through these dimensions of psychopathology?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. So, consistent with the dimensional view of psychopathology, a number of researchers have attempted to reconceptualize psychopathology using factor analysis. For example, early factor analytic work showed that certain symptoms cluster together. Importantly, this early work also began to uncover a hierarchical structure of psychopathology that identified a general psychopathology factor, also called the P factor, which reflects the overall burden of psychopathology in an individual. This can be thought of as something similar to what's called the G factor in cognition research, which represents broad mental capacity that influences performance on cognitive ability and cognitive testing. Likewise, the P factor quantifies the overall level of psychopathology present across clinical domains. So in our study, we used a factor analytic approach called a bifactor model to quantify hierarchical dimensions of psychopathology. To do this, we applied an exploratory factor analysis to 112 items in a psychiatric screening interview, which was collected in the entire sample of 9,500 youth. This exploratory factor analysis yielded 4 dimensions of psychopathology, including factors for anxious misery, psychosis, behavioral symptoms, and fear. We then used the confirmatory bifactor analysis to model these 4 factors, plus the 5th factor that was common across all disorders, which we called overall psychopathology. Importantly, all these factors are uncorrelated and can be examined together. We then used our dimensions of psychopathology to identify both common and dissociable neurostructural deficits across disorders.
So you used a novel method to identify structural brain networks. How does this approach work, and what are the benefits?
Yeah, this is a great question. Neuroimaging data is high dimensional, meaning we are collecting data from thousands of voxels in the brain. Working with such high dimensional data can be challenging in terms of correcting for multiple comparisons to avoid false positive findings. So one method neuroimagers use to deal with this is data reduction. So in order to reduce the dimensionality of our structural data, we used a technique called non-negative matrix factorization, or NMF. NMF is similar to principal component analysis, or PCA, which is just another method for data reduction. But unlike PCA, NMF produces compact positive sign components, which increases interpretability. In contrast, PCA and other data reduction techniques produce widely dispersed networks that have both positive and negative directions, which often limits straightforward interpretations. The components derived from NMF are beneficial because they align well with known functional brain networks, they're highly reproducible, and they maximize statistical power by limiting multiple comparisons. Using NMF, we were able to identify 18 structural components, which we show in Figure 2, which we can then relate to the dimensions of psychopathology that we just talked about earlier.
Well, all right, so let's get to the results of your study. What were your main findings with regard to the connection between dimensions of psychopathology and structural differences in brain networks?
So what we found was a dissociable relationship relationship, whereby fear was most strongly linked to reduced cortical thickness and overall psychopathology was most strongly linked to global reductions in gray matter volume. In particular, fear symptoms were associated with reduced cortical thickness in most networks, which is consistent with case control studies in adults showing cortical thinning in disorders such as post-traumatic stress disorder, specific phobia, and social anxiety disorder. However, we build upon prior work by demonstrating this association using a dimensional measure of fear symptoms. In addition, we found that overall psychopathology was associated with globally reduced gray matter volume across all networks. This is consistent with prior work reporting common gray matter volume loss across multiple psychiatric disorders, as well as with studies showing reduced volume associated with the P factor in adults. Importantly, while the majority of translational psychiatric imaging studies have considered adults, in this study we extend these findings to a community-based sample of youth. Our results suggest both common and dissociable neurostructural deficits associated with dimensions of psychopathology in youth.
You also reported on whether information about psychopathology could be gleaned from structural networks in the brain, above and beyond demographic characteristics and cognitive performance. What did your team document here?
Yes, thank you for asking. As an additional analysis, we wanted to determine whether the relationship between structural brain networks and psychopathology may be influenced by some other effect. For example, we know that smaller brain volumes are associated with poorer cognition. In addition, there may be confounding effects due to differences in demographic variables. Therefore, in addition to examining univariate associations between each structural covariance network and each dimension of psychopathology, we also examined whether structural networks predicted psychopathology above and beyond demographic characteristics and cognitive performance. So to do this, we compared a reduced model that included age, sex, and cognition to a full model with age, sex, cognition, and the structural networks as predictors of psychopathology. We found that the proportion of variance in psychopathology explained by the predictors improved in the full model, suggesting that structural networks are providing additional important information about psychopathology symptoms above and beyond demographic characteristics and cognitive performance alone.
So what do you think further studies should aim to explore in this line of research?
Yeah, well, there's a lot more to do. Future work should examine the association between dimensions of psychopathology in youth and other neuroimaging modalities, including functional connectivity and white matter integrity. Future work would also benefit from longitudinal designs that are better able to capture the trajectory of these developmental changes in order to better understand the timing of these effects. Currently, we really don't know whether neurostructural deficits are driving greater psychopathology symptoms or whether these deficits emerge as a consequence of the disease process. Lastly, we need studies that measure brain structure at an earlier age range to capture the onset of these effects in order to better develop targeted interventions that might bend the curve of psychopathology.
And finally, based on your findings, what would you say are some of the implications your work has for researchers, clinicians, and other mental health professionals?
Yeah, so I'd be happy to answer that. So our results have implications for understanding how abnormalities of brain development may be associated with different dimensions of psychopathology. Neurostructural deficits may be a risk factor for the development of psychiatric disorders. To understand the implications of our findings, we have to keep in mind what normative brain development looks like. In normative developmental samples, an initial rapid expansion of the brain early in life is actually followed by a relatively longer period of reductions in cortical thickness and volume due to normal processes such as pruning. However, our results suggest that psychopathology is associated with greater reductions in cortical thickness and volume than would be expected in a healthy sample. This may be due to a number of different factors. First, this could suggest a structural abnormality that is present early in life or even in utero that is then fixed throughout development. And such an abnormality could be due to early life events, such as maternal infections during pregnancy or complications during birth. Alternatively, our results could be due to a flattened trajectory of cortical expansion in early childhood, with youth simply not reaching normative levels of peak cortical volume and thickness. Or these results may be consistent with an accelerated course or earlier onset of the normative process of cortical thinning and gray matter volume loss. There is some evidence that early life experiences, such as childhood adversity, may actually accelerate the process of cortical maturation. So to reiterate Dr. Satterthwaite's point, we need to follow large samples of youth longitudinally from early in life, as well as acquire detailed data regarding pregnancy and the childhood environment in order to better understand the clinical implications of these associations.
Dr. Antonia Gezkirchen and Dr. Theodore Satterthwaite, co-authors of the lead article in our December issue on dimensions of psychopathology and brain structure in young people. Thank you both for speaking with us.
Thank you so much. It should be noted that this non-negative matrix factorization technique that we use to delineate neurostructural networks was developed by our collaborators Christos Stavitsikos and Aris Satiris.
Yes, thank you. And we also want to thank Drs. Gur and Hekkenarson for the use of the PNC dataset, as well as the PNC participants and their families for their participation.
This concludes this episode of AJP Audio. You can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to it. Please also visit our website, ajp.psychiatryonline.org, to check out trending articles, find CME courses, and watch videos highlighting some of our other articles. APA Publishing has other podcasts you can listen to. Psychiatry Unbound is the books podcast from APA Publishing. It's hosted by Dr. Laura Roberts, Editor-in-Chief of APA Books. Also check out From Pages to Practice, which reviews the latest research published in the journal Psychiatric Services. It's hosted by Dr. Lisa Dixon, Editor-in-Chief of the journal, along with Dr. Josh Beresin. You can subscribe to these podcasts on Apple, Google, Spotify, or on any of the popular platforms. Next month in AJP Audio, we'll talk with Dr. Stephen Buca of Brown University about his research on maternal bacterial infection during pregnancy and the risk of psychotic disorders among offspring. We hope you'll join us too. Thank you for listening.